Today we are solving real-world problems involving fractions and percents. This is a continuation of the previous lesson of solving real-world problems for increase and decrease of percents, or percent increase and decrease. You need your notebook and a pencil. You can write anything. You have to write anything that's blue or any color, but you do not have to write what is written in black or typed. So let's dive in. Jada has a box of 2,000 beads. 25% of the beads are red, 3/5 of the remaining beads are blue, and the rest are green. Find the number of green beads. So the first thing we did is draw a model. We know that there are 2,000 beads total. And we know that 25% of the beads are red. We know that 3/5 of the remaining, so 3/5 of the remaining are blue, and then the rest are green. We know that 100% minus 25% is 75%, right? So blue and green make up 75%. So the first thing that we're going to do, since we know that there are a total of 2,000 beads, we're going to find what is 75% of 2,000. So to find 75% of 2,000, we do 75 over 100 times by 2,000. Again, you can type this, you can use a calculator as long as you show your work. If you type this into your calculator, you should get 1,500. So this means that we know that 1,500 beads are blue and green. Okay. Now, we know that of these 75%, these 1,500 beads, 3/5 of them are blue. And so if 3/5 are blue, how much are green? So we can do 1 minus 3/5, which gives us 2/5. So 2/5 are green. And we're trying to find the number of green beads. So 2/5 are green. So we're trying to find 2/5 of 1,500. And to do that, we do 2/5 times 1,500, and we get 600. So there are 600 green beads. So we just used what we know to solve real-world problems involving percents and fractions. Mr. Nelson's salary is $2,500. His salary is 15% more than that of Mr. Parker's. Each month, Mr. Parker saves 2/5 of his salary. Find the amount of money Mr. Parker spends each month. Okay. We know that Mr. Nelson's is the 100% because we told, based on this, that Mr. Parker's salary is 15% less because Mr. Nelson's is 15% more. Okay. So if we take 100% minus 15%, this means that Mr. Parker's salary is 85% total of Mr. Nelson's, which is 2,500. So 85% of 2,500 would be 85 over 100 times by 2,500. And you should get $2,125. So that means that Mr. Parker's salary is $2,125. Okay? And so we know that of his $2,125, he saves 2/5 of it, which means that he spends how much? So if we take 1 and minus 2/5, we're left with 3/5, and he spends 3/5. So Mr. Parker spends 3/5 of $2,125. How much is that? So we would do 3/5 times, because of 2,125, and we should get $1,275. So Mr. Parker spends $1,275 each month. So, on your own, Sebastian has a collection of cards. 30% of the cards are baseball cards, 1/2 of the remaining cards are football cards, and the rest are basketball cards. If he had 35 basketball cards, how many cards does he have in all? You need to draw this model, and then you need to label it with the information that you're given from the word problem. Pause this video, come back and check your work. So he has 30% are baseball, and then we have 1/2 of the remaining, but we have to figure out the remaining. So 100% minus 30% equals 70%. So he has 1/2 of 70% is here, is football. And that means the rest are basketball, which is also 1/2 of 70%. Right? So we can find out how much is 1/2 of 70%, or you just divide 70 by 2. So 70% divided by 2 is 35%. So basketball is 35%, and football is 35%, and baseball is 30%. We know that 35% is 35 cards. To find 1%, we do 35 divided by 35, and so 1% is 1. So 100% would be 100, or 100 times 1, which is 100. So this means that Sebastian has 100 cards. Now we're going to do solving real-world problems involving the concept of percent of a percent. Students in a class were asked to pick their favorite sport from basketball, football, and hockey. 40% of the students chose basketball, 75% of the remaining students chose football, and the rest chose hockey. What percent of the students chose football? So here we have drawn our model. We know that this was the total amount of students. We don't know that number, but we know 40% chose basketball and the rest are remaining. The remaining amount is 100% minus 40%, which is 60%. And we know that football was 75% of our 60%. So 60% of the students chose football or hockey. Now we're trying to find what is 75% of 60%. And we do this the same way. So 75% is 75 over 100 times by 60%. You can type this on your calculator, 75 divided by 100 times by 60, and you should get 45. And we bring down the percent sign. So 45% of the students chose football. Given that 6 students chose hockey, how many students were there in the class? So now we're taking our 45% and we're using that information. And if we remember from our problem, we know that 40% like basketball, 45% like football. We remember that the 60% here like football and hockey, like together. So if 45% is football, what is hockey? So we can do 60% minus 45%, which is 15%. So hockey is 15%, and we know that 15% is 6 people. So to find 1%, we do 6 divided by 15, which is 4/10. So to find 100%, so to find all the students, we're going to do 100% equals 4/10 times 100, which equals 40. So there were 40 students in the class. A box contains pencils, pens, and markers. 20% of the items in the box are pencils, 50% of the remaining items are pens, and the rest are markers. What percent of the items in the box are pens? So first we want to find out what percent is remaining. So the remaining is made up of pens and markers. And we have to do 100% minus 20%, which is 80%. So 80% of our box is pens and markers. And we know that 50% of the 80% are pens. And if it's 50%, then the other is 50% are markers. So 50% of 80% is 50 over 100 times by 80, which equals 40. So this is 40% of the total, which makes the markers also 40%. So it asks for what percent of the items in the box are pens. 40% of the items in the box are pens. Given that there are 32 markers, how many items are there in the box? So we are trying to find the total number here. We know that there are 32 markers. And if we know that the remaining is 80% and the pens are 40%, the markers also make up 40%. So 40% is 32. Find 1%. 32 divided by 40, which equals 8/10. To find 100%, because we're trying to find how many items are in the box, we do 8/10 times 100, which equals 80. So there are 80 items in the box. And so that is how you use percents of a percent to find the answer to real world problems. This one we're going to try on your own. Some fruit were delivered to a stall. 20% of the fruit were oranges, 35% of the remaining fruit were apples, and the rest were pears. What percent of the fruit were apples? Draw your model. It's drawn for you, but you need to label it. Come back and check your work. So you should have that the oranges are 20%, and that means that the remaining is 80% because 100% minus 20% equals 80%. So 80% of the remaining fruit were apples and pears. Okay. We know that 35% of the remaining 80% were apples. So 35% of 80%, which is 35 over 100 times by 80, is 28%. So 28% of the fruit were apples, because 35% of the 80% remaining were apples. And so to find the percentage of the total, you have to do 35% of 80%. So given that there were 65 pears, how many pieces of fruit were delivered to the stall? We know oranges were 20%. Pause this video. How do you find how many pieces of fruit were there total? Well, you need to find the percentage of this one. And to find that, you would do 80% minus 28%, because remember the remaining part is 80%. 80% minus 28% is 52%. So the amount of pears is 52%. 52% is 65 pears. Find 1%, which is 65 divided by 52, which equals 1 and 25/100. Then we would find the 100%, moving our decimal, 125. So there were 125 pieces of fruit delivered to the store. So we're going to go back to our problem from the beginning of yesterday, where Jeff needed to travel 72 kilometers to get to the next town. He drove 15% of the distance. He then traveled 2/3 of the remaining distance by bus. How many more miles does Jeff need to travel? Okay, so I don't know if I'll be able to turn this all blue. All right. So let's solve this. Okay. The total travel time was 72 kilometers, and he drove 15%. He took a bus for 2/3 of the remaining distance by bus. How many more miles does Jeff need to travel? Okay. So first we need to find out what is the remaining percentage. The remaining percentage would be 100% minus 15%, which is 85%. He took 2/3 of that trip by bus, which means that how much he has left? We do 1 minus 2/3, which is 1/3. So this is 1/3 that he has remaining. And it's 1/3 of 85%. So 1/3 of 85%. But first we have to find out what is 85% of the kilometers. So we have to do, 85% of 72. So 85 over 100 times by 72 equals 61.2. And then we want to find 1/3 of 61.2. And that equals 20.4. So he has 20.4 miles remaining. All right, so there are multiple steps when solving problems, and that's okay. All right, your homework is page 355 to 356, 7, 8, 9, and 10.